Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Stephen Sparks. I'm going to mute you, Cal. I think I might be hearing myself. I'll turn you back on. I think that'll work. Technical details. This is a perfect introduction to various things that can occur when you're doing these online events. Most of you, I feel like at this point, a year plus into these kind of things, know the layout, the landscape here. But we have a chat box. Feel free to let us know where you're tuning in from, or any other comments or questions. We love an active chat during these events. It's kind of a nice way to see who's here and what's kind of striking you. We also have an ask a question box below me here. Feel free to ask a question at any point during the event, and we'll get to those kind of toward the end of the hour. There's a buy the book, a very important buy the book button below me too. I always say I don't care where you get the book, get it from your local library, your local bookstore. Just definitely get your hands on Cal Flynn's amazing Islands of Abandonment. I had reached out to Cal, I think on Twitter, to tell her how excited I was about this book after hearing about it for months. I think in the UK Twitter, nature Twitter, environmental Twitter feeds, and so I was not disappointed at all when I got my hands on it and was able to read it. And I'm honored to be here in conversation with Cal today. Just a couple of quick upcoming events to people here that may be of interest to people here. On June 30th, we have Gillian Rose and Jen Bervin or Gillian Osborne. I get that name wrong every time, I don't know why. She has a new essay collection called Green, 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 which is just beautiful. A lot to do with the color green and lichen and motherhood and living in the West. A lot of things that are kind of near and dear to all of our hearts here at Point Reyes Books. July 22nd, another book that kind of strikes me as kind of a tandem piece to Cal's book, Lisa Wells' new book called Believers, which deals with a lot of the issues raised by Cal in Islands of Abandonment. Lisa travels mostly through the American West and talks to kind of modern day hunter-gatherers and reseeding and rewilders in New Mexico, and talks to people who are looking at permaculture restoration in Paradise, California after the fire, and various communal living enterprises throughout the West. It's a really intriguing book, and it does kind of strike me as of a piece with Islands of Abandonment. July 23rd, Christina Conklin will be discussing her beautifully illustrated new project called The Atlas of Disappearing Places, about climate change and coasts. These and other events are all available on Crowdcast. You can see if you got here, you'll see the full lineup, and you can register for those prior to the event or the day of. And as with all of our events, or 99% of our events, they're sliding scale, so you can attend for free. We want to make sure you're able to see these events. And with that, when I do these conversations, I feel like I talk much more than I would normally talk doing a quick intro. But I want to introduce our guest this evening, where she is, this afternoon where we are. So Cal Flynn is an author, an investigative journalist, and a McDowell Fellow from the Highlands of Scotland. She's worked as a reporter for the Sunday Times and the Telegraph, and has contributed to publications including Granta, The Guardian, The Times, The Observer, and others. Her first book, Thicker Than Water, was one of Time's best books of 2016, and her new book, just out in the US from Viking, is Islands of Abandonment, as I mentioned. Cal, welcome, and thank you again for joining us here today. Oh. Here, okay.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Do you have another browser open by any chance? Well, that might be the case. We'll try that, and I'll unmute you. Let's see. How about now?
Okay. Is that better? Is that better?
I'm gonna try to unmute. Sorry, everybody. These are the things that happen. Okay. How about now?
Okay. Testing.
Let's see here. A couple of things we can try. I'm gonna I'm going to toggle the mic here. I'm going to toggle your camera and I'll bring you back up. In the meantime, anybody in the chat, tell us what drew you to the book. I'm going to minimize Cal and bring her back up. Here we go.
Okay.
Sorry. Are you using Safari or Chrome?
I'm in Chrome.
Okay, I'm going to try one more thing, everybody. I'm going to just get rid of Cal again, and I'm going to invite you back on the screen, and we'll see. Maybe that'll do something. It's funny. This wasn't happening before. Let's try that. Hold on. Well, everybody, thanks for your patience as we continue to navigate this.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
Let's say, all right. In the meantime, Aaron B has said that the book is incredible and worth waiting for. So thank you, Aaron. That's great. I mean, these are the things, right? This is like part of our reality these days. And totally worth a slight technical hassle to have you join us from 5,000 miles away or whatever it is. I was wondering, maybe to get started, to give us kind of a sense of the book, which is really, I mean, you could say better than me, but it's journeys kind of to post-human places and very post-human in various senses, which I hope we can get to kind of examine how nature reacts or reverts when humans, or human industry maybe is more accurate, departs. And so through the book, you bring us to, we were talking before, I'm originally from New Jersey, so Paterson is kind of a place that I know, Estonia, Tanzania, Scotland, and of course, one of the most famous and probably an exemplar of this kind of landscape is Chernobyl. And so I wondered, you had mentioned that you often read a bit from that section. If you would like to kind of give us a sense of the book by reading a passage from Chernobyl.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, because Chernobyl is I think it's almost like a poster child example of the kind of phenomenon, the kind of place that I'm interested in. It was the first place I traveled to. It was the sample chapter when I first put together the idea of my book. So yeah, I've got a couple of pages I'm just going to read you just to give you a sense of, I suppose, my style of writing. I step outside, descend a set of steps, and as I do, from nowhere, the dosimeter in my pocket raises its voice from the occasional background click to the crackle of white noise, before overloading and sounding its warning alarm, a two-note siren of a timbre and pitch that seems intended to fluster. A jolt of adrenaline hits my system. What's happening? I blurt out, embarrassingly panicked, but unable to contain myself. The silence, the inodorousness, the invisibility of the danger preys on my mind. I'm blindfolded in a room of poisoned daggers. What's happening? Ludmilla waves my panic away. Hotspot, she says, and my fear evaporates with a label in the way a grave medical diagnosis might sometimes bring relief. She points to the bottom step. Liquidators returning from the reactor area kicked the dirt from their boots and removed their clothes here before getting into minibuses that parked out front. These minibuses, too contaminated to save, would later be buried in vast mass graves lined with concrete. The dust they left behind has left a radioactive trace which persists into the present. I hold my dosimeter over what seems to be the hotspot's epicenter, a concrete slab shrouded in leaf mold, and watch the numbers climbing. It stops at 15.82 microsieverts an hour, around 100 times the background dose. Ludmilla thrusts her hand out over mine. The dosimeter in her grip is bigger and more professional looking, and its reading is different, higher. It likes cesium, she shrugs, and although I don't understand, I feel myself jealous. Can I hold it? I ask. I take the wailing device, and when I step away, it falls silent, and I relax. The sky is white cloud, too bright to look at. The air is still. I follow the steps down to the cafe's private jetty, from which I look out across a smooth curve of ice that lids the lake's surface, one that does not break when I drop a rock onto it. What I think about is this, how the past is imprinted upon the present, in every place, but never more tangibly than here. I navigate it blindly in the present, with a torch, with a dosimeter as a torch. The zone is full of hotspots, and sometimes they've been marked by small yellow lollipop signposts whose triangular faces were the nuclear trefoil, the international symbol for ionizing radiation, in red. The signs are planted throughout the zone, marking places to avoid, and they're not dangerous exactly, but you shouldn't stand there long. At the city limits, we pass another on the side of the road. Can we stop? I say, and the driver shrugs. I get out and cross to the verge by the sign and keep stepping until I hear the warble of the dosimeter, and all I see is a field of thick, tussocky grass poking through a thin layer of snow, ungrazed, unmown. Pine seedlings are bristling on the edges of the clearing amid a shimmer of birch, thin upper limbs of russet and wine over silvered, glimmering torsos. A thin white mist hangs about a foot over the ground, ethereal and waiting to be parted. It has started to snow, and heavy flakes fall in slow motion onto my hair and my crown. I shut my eyes, feeling cold fingers touching my face, and visualize the radiation washing over me, bathing me in a current of which I am only abstractly aware, whose existence is a matter of faith. It is one thing to understand the concept in a lecture, I think, and another altogether to comprehend your body at the mercy of it. It takes a certain mystical frame of mind, one I'm not unfamiliar with. I surrender myself to it, to its greater power, and I feel my boundaries blur and grow indistinct. Gamma rays pass through me on their way elsewhere. After a minute or so, I step away and hear the siren fall to a crackle. I feel nothing. I think I am not afraid.
Wow, thank you for that. It must be, well, this immediately brings up two things about the title, both the word islands and the word abandonment. You know, in the book you use islands in sort of a more metaphorical sense, although in a few cases in a literal sense. And I wonder if you can kind of elaborate a little bit on that, you know, these, like how you conceive of an island, you know, within, you know, in this case, a landlocked place, but among the other places that you also visited.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose once I started looking into abandoned places in ecological terms, I kept coming up against this phrase, well, the use of the word island to describe these places as sort of islands of wildness. And I talk about it in the first chapter where I talk about spoil heaps, giant spoil heaps, which we have in Scotland called bings. And a local ecologist made a survey there and found lots of different species on these spoil heaps, and she described them as island refugia for life. And I found that idea quite, I don't know, I think sort of moving, this idea that we have all of these islands everywhere, and you can kind of think of the world around us as being archipelagos of abandonment or wildness, and all of them sort of serving as archives or safe spaces, sanctuaries for different wild species. Some of those islands are very tiny, and some of them are very large. So the Chernobyl exclusion zone must be one of the largest, in as much as I think it's around the size of Rhode Island for American readers, and in the UK we think of it as being the size of Cornwall, which is quite a large county for us. And the thought of that as being almost entirely abandoned, and I suppose allowed to revert to some kind of wilder nature, I think is, well, it's interesting, but it's also provocative, because immediately people start asking, you know, well, is it okay then that we have damaged these places if they can recover? And then part of the book goes on to explore that notion, which is, I suppose, this idea of ecological memory, or how we imprint ourselves onto the planet, and how even after humans are gone, traces of us will be left in the world around us for millennia.
Yeah. I think of David Ferrier's recent book, that kind of traces this. You know, what will we leave behind in geological, like, long time, and Chernobyl, Chernobyl footprints. It's called. I don't know if that's the same title there, but an incredible kind of thought, and this kind of similarly ties into that. Which, you know, there are these kind of currents that are moving in you know, I guess what we call nature writing these days, and yours both kind of squarely falls within the tradition, but also, like, I think does interesting things in moving outside of it. It's as much a personal book as about your personal journeys, which I found remarkable, and I hope we can talk a little bit about the personal aspect. But it's also history. I mean, these places don't exist in and of themselves. They're not cut off in time, or, they might seem like they're set aside, but there's a reason for that. And as you travel, and like the book seems to be structured in a way that you're moving from various kinds of, post-industrial, post-colonial too, in some senses. And maybe you would agree or not, but maybe I can ask about that. That a lot of these places are in fact post-colonial and post-industrial, and the ethics, as you just mentioned, of what it means. If we look at these places and say like, wow, what an amazing reversion that has taken place. It's great. We can just abandon more land and things will be fine. But so in your journeys, I mean, all these things seem to be in your mind through my reading of the book. And that you tie all these together in this really intriguing way that does raise a lot of ethical questions. And so I wonder sort of like the ethics of it, as you as a traveler were visiting places like this, was that in your mind, and how do you grapple with that?
I think absolutely, and rightly, I think it has to be. So there was a very good quote. I mentioned it in the introduction actually, but I had this in my mind the whole time while I was writing the book. Of Henry James talked about his practice of ruin questing. He was just as obsessed of abandoned places as any urban explorer might be today. But he talked about how if you were only interested in the ruins and not in the human stories behind it, it was something of a heartless pastime. And I think that speaks very squarely to this idea of ruin porn today, and especially visiting somewhere, Chernobyl to an extent, but most especially I think in Detroit. This was something I thought about a great deal, which was that how do you write about a place in a fresh way when a lot of people, including people from Detroit, have written a lot about the city, and it is abandoned in some places and it's not abandoned in others. So, what does that tell us about what it means to be abandoned in an urban setting? And I think so much of it has to be about respecting a place and respecting people that you meet, and generally sort of being friendly and open-hearted when you meet people was, I think, the most important thing. So going into, for example, the abandoned mills in Paterson, so there's this very large sort of burnt out industrial complex in the heart of the city, which I went into for the book, and it's very overgrown, but it's also being used in some parts as a sort of homeless encampment, and I talk about how these people are living, I suppose, in the wreckage of capitalism, almost. I mean, exactly, that's what it is. And speaking to people like that, it's not like you can sort of make contact in advance. You can't easily email someone in this situation to say, I'm going to pop down. So I guess my background as a reporter has prepared me to have these kind of conversations, which is you go in and you have to sort of be careful not to upset anyone and try and open a conversation. And my main thing is just, if I'm talking to people, especially if I've only just met them, I'm very keen that they only tell me what they're happy to tell. I don't like to pry, but you do find that when you speak to people, as I say, in that kind of warm and open-hearted way, people want to tell you and talk to you and explain why they're choosing to live in the way that they are. So I think that sorry, this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, but that's I guess how I've been approaching it, of just trying not to pry, going to a place, but if you feel unwelcome, you step back, and if people don't want to write about them, then absolutely, you have to respect that.
Yeah, and it seems to me, in those, both in that human way and in the way that you write about the natural world, that you're taking a very wide historical view, and actually like a kind of a meta view. The idea that ruins, it probably wasn't until the 17th or 18th century that ruins sort of became something that people wanted to see and would travel to see, right? It's like a historical scope. And I think your idea of both ruins and nature has this sense of like, what do we think of in the current moment, but what maybe are some of our blind spots? The idea of pristine nature, or even the word reverting, it doesn't feel, I kind of like the word rebounding that is in the subtitle, because it has a more kind of evocative and looser sense to me of what nature might look like in these places. And were there any particular surprises about what nature does look like in some of the places that you visited?
Yes, I think one of the things I was very quickly surprised by was how quickly these habitats and landscapes have changed. So often they are reforested faster than you would expect. They regrow very quickly. So when it comes to abandoned buildings in particular, they can stand very firm and look almost untouched for quite a long time. But the second water gets in through the roof, that's kind of end game. And after that, things move very fast. So forests can pop up sort of right on the doorstep of houses so that you can no longer open the door, this kind of thing. So you do get the sense that even though it's too slow for us to see with a naked eye, that there are sort of movements going on constantly, and in fact their slowness in terms of the regrowth of plants is the thing that allows us not to notice until they're sort of too close. And I don't know, I found that quite creepy. But one thing that I think the chapter that really surprised me most of all is the chapter I talk about a clearing in the woods in Verdun in France, where they burnt chemical weapons. And so they have this very polluted, contaminated clearing in the woods, which is full of lead and arsenic, and lots of heavy metals have sunk into the soil. But studying that area in particular, and those plants that are beginning to come back into this incredibly polluted soil, led me down this really interesting path about metallophyte plants, and how metals can have all of these crazy effects on plants and change their colors. So for example, you can sort of add metal salts to certain plants and their petals will change color, or they will show this sort of chlorosis type bleaching marks, or they might become gigantic, or they might shrink. And I think all of that kind of thing, and that sort of almost hocus pocus feeling to it, I just found completely charming. And not only in that one location, but in a lot of post-industrial sites, especially metal mining, you do find these plants popping up, and they're of great scientific significance. So often in these very polluted areas, you've got, I think of them as forbidden experiments. I use that phrase because it would be completely unethical to create these situations on purpose just to study them for scientific reasons. But now that they exist, they are extremely fascinating from a sort of ecological scientific perspective.
Yeah, and you mentioned Lovelock's kind of wild hypothesis, or thought experiment, maybe to do just that almost, right? Can you explain that actually for people watching?
Sure. So I will probably bungle this a little bit, because he and a woman called Lynn Margulis, James Lovelock, Lynn Margulis, worked together on this hypothesis called the Gaia Hypothesis. And to put it in sort of very plain language, it's almost an anthropomorphic idea of the planet as being some kind of self-regulating mechanism. So it will try and control the temperature, it will try and control oxygen levels in the atmosphere to keep things at a level by which its constituent parts can live. So it's thinking of the planet almost as a body. And it is, and it isn't a thought experiment. They did sort of dig down into sort of the chemistry of it and the processes by which it might happen. But I think, to me, it's certainly, its value is as a thought experiment. This idea of having feedback loops that might go up or they might go down. So negative feedback loops, that Gaia hypothesis, which would make it tend towards what it's always been, versus the other positive loops, which is what we're scared of now, and in terms of climate change, which is if methane under the sea starts bubbling up because it's melted, the methane might then act to make the temperature spiral out of control. So there's another sort of opposing thought experiment type theory, which has been called the Medea hypothesis, and that's the idea of a sort of suicidal Earth, which once you set it down this destructive path, it might spiral out of control. And that's what climatologists are really frightened of now. But James Lovelock, I think he's such a powerful thinker, and he's come up with all sorts of very provocative ideas. So not only the Gaia hypothesis, but in Chernobyl, I talk about how he even suggested one time, given the success, I suppose, depending on how you're thinking of it, of the exclusion zone in Chernobyl in attracting wildlife back in and acting as a kind of sanctuary in a very built up area of Europe, maybe we should go about to some of the most amazing untouched areas of Earth and leave dangerous pieces of radioactive waste to stop people going into them, to scare people off. I don't know how like for real he's being, but it's like, it's a provocative idea, right? He throws stuff out there and people respond to it, and I think that is I don't know, it's always interesting to sort of wrestle with its ideas.
Yeah, and all these kind of ethical questions I think that you bring up in these very concrete, particular ways throughout your travels, and it kind of leads me to this thought that you have this beautiful line in the book, you know, because I think a lot of the book also deals with how we think about the world and the climate at this moment in the future, where you say, you know, I think there's reasons to be hopeful, but it's not a pardon but a reprieve, which I find sort of like, that's like a great mantra for any time that we, you know, we feel a little more optimistic, or that we can just leave something alone and that it will be fine and regenerate itself. Because even in Chernobyl, you mentioned, you know, the animals have shorter lives, or there's various other, you know, problems that still kind of continue. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, maybe, I'm trying to think of some of the was there a particular place, maybe I'll let you make the decision, that kind of conundrum was most felt for you, where, you know, it felt like things were amazingly regenerative, but at the same time, either there's, you know, a real sense of damage and loss, or, you know, or just this eerie sense that you experienced in Chernobyl in particular.
Yeah, I guess there's two types of damage, I suppose, that you can think about. And so one of them, I guess Chernobyl is a very strong, clear example of that sort of the physical damage that we have done to an environment, and how, you know, as I mentioned before, it sort of laces itself into the earth there, and the future in Chernobyl, even if it rebounds and it's full of life, it's not the same as it was before. You know, like certain species are favored over other species. So pine forests don't do well in radiation, but birch does. So birch pops up instead. You know, it tends to be broadleaf forest. Certain species have benefit and others have not. So I guess you have that example, but you also have places where there's social damage, and maybe the fall of the USSR is an interesting example there. So in that chapter, I go to Estonia to look at the forest that has regrown and is in the process of regrowing on former collective farms. So during the time of the Soviet Union, a lot of effort and kind of force was used to make smaller family farms combine together, so that whole villages or whole towns would work together in these massive enterprises. And in the 90s, after the fall of the country, these farms often fell apart. You know, people had a choice not to be farmers, and they chose not to. And it was very difficult to retrace the steps by which these farms had been formed, and so it was difficult to reunite the original owners with the land. And even when they did things had changed, and perhaps they'd become an urbanized population. So huge amounts of farmland in Estonia, but all across the former Soviet Union are regrowing as forest. And so, you know, I think how do I phrase it in the book? It's something to do with, you know, what kind of trade-off is this? You know, it's a terrible collapse and an economic crisis for all those people involved. And now we have this great carbon sink. I think it's hard to argue in favor of anything like this happening. You know, it's not so much that we want that to happen. It's just that one impact has been that we have this enormous, probably the biggest ever man-made carbon sink growing up on this former Soviet land. So yeah, I think all the time, yeah, as you mentioned, ethics is a big consideration to me. It's always the questions that I find myself drawn to. So previously, my first book is a book about colonialism in Australia. I've followed a story in my family tree. A distant relative went across to Australia, I suppose, to start a new life, and he became, quote unquote, an explorer. He was an early white settler, and he was caught up in violence on the frontier in Australia against Aboriginal people, and that Aboriginal group was very badly impacted. And so I looked at how that had affected the Gaia Hypothesis people since then. And one thing that sort of shocked me was that after that time of open conflict, open warfare, there was also a sort of second wave of colonialist effects, which was perpetrated by people who actually only meant the best. So this is where you see kind of the stolen generation or sort of cultural impacts when people are trying to civilize other people. And it's not so much that it's the same thing in this situation, but I suppose that experience of writing that book sharpened my eyes to this sense that people can have good intentions and yet do very bad things, or do something that they think will be good but has strange impacts. And I suppose the ethics of conservation is now a really big topic to me, because I think always people who are working in conservation always want the best. They only want to do the good things. But when we come to really sort of interventionist forms of conservation, I think we need to have so many big discussions about the ethics of that, because it's not always obvious what the good and the right thing to do is, and often theories conflict. This is a bit of a tangent.
No, well, it leads to you're really good in the book at kind of bringing up the complexity of ecologies and the kind of how complex ecology is, and the things that we know that we don't know. I was really struck when you were visiting Montserrat, the post-volcanic landscape, where you then tie it into the history of the conquest of North America, the Black Death, genocide in North and South America, to the Little Ice Age. I mean, these like complex strands that get woven together to kind of show how interconnected all of these things are, and each of these landscapes in various ways kind of falls into that. Actually, if you wouldn't mind explaining to everyone how some folks theorize that all of those things are related. It's such an intriguing and large scale and kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess I started writing about, I knew that I needed to, as a sort of responsible person, one has to write about climate change in basically every environmental book that you've got these days. It is so significant, and I suppose I was sort of anticipating this idea that if I'm saying that everything's going to be fine, we've got forest regrowing, but if climate change does continue to spin out of control, then we're looking at rebounding and recovery, but on such enormous timescales that probably we as humans will not be here to see it. So I knew that I needed to have a chapter on climate change, and strangely I found that my way into it was via Montserrat in the Caribbean. And so I talked there about the volcano that suddenly appeared next to their capital town, that flooded the capital town with pyroclastic flows. So these are superheated gas and rocks of the kind that flowed through Pompeii and its neighboring town. So if you have a sense of that and its impact. And then from the volcano, I guess I started looking at how volcanoes feed into the climate of the whole Earth, and especially super volcanoes, of which we are sort of, in geological terms, we're sort of due one any moment, but in human life terms, it's probably going to be quite a while. But just that sort of sense of how the climate of the Earth can change, and it has changed many times in the past. It just has these sort of huge events. Suddenly it's a lot hotter, suddenly it's a lot colder, and that's when we get ice ages coming in. And now, I suppose if you look at, in terms of our impact on the climate, and this, most especially the speed at which we're impacting it, we're now essentially a super volcano. That's what we're doing. So we're fiddling around sort of under the bonnet of the Earth and sending it slightly haywire. But I looked at how, to come back to this point of the Black Death and so on, this is all tied together with human activity over the Earth. So there are many theories about how long ago humans started impacting climate, and many people in earth sciences, although it's always contested in this subject, believe that we started impacting the climate a long time ago, probably 8,000 years ago, when we started doing agriculture, and our impact on the planet has sort of steadily increased over then. But during those times, whenever there was a sort of, I guess, a die-off of people, to put it in the boldest terms, you can see that in the ice cores. If you look at the bubbles that are sort of saved in cores of ice, you can find out basically what the chemical composition of the air was at certain times. They build up in layers, and so they can be quite specific about that. And so they have traced various sort of human disasters and its impact on the climate in the decades and centuries after by doing that. And so they find that times when we've had really terrible tragic events, so like the Black Death, actually like the when Genghis Khan was storming across Eurasia, killing really huge numbers of people. You can see that in the climate records. There's tree regrowth on agricultural land, and the biggest one of all is what's called the Great Dying amongst paleoclimatologists and sort of prehistorians. And this is when Columbus or post-Columbus sailors brought smallpox and other viruses to the New World. It spread through, and so many people died on such an enormous scale that that's the biggest impact that we see. And so I talk about in the book how when explorers were coming across, or not so much explorers, but European settlers were coming to the Americas, and they found this incredible sort of Arcadian scene, and it was all wildlife and it was all forest, and actually this was a post-apocalyptic landscape, and this was I guess an inhabited landscape that had been so badly impacted by illness that it had changed on such an enormous scale.
Yeah, remarkable, and really kind of reconceptualizing the way that we think about these places like this. Like closest to us here is the Salton Sea, which in some ways feels like another post-apocalyptic landscape, and brings up a lot of the themes in the book. I think is it the last chapter? If not the last, so, okay, yeah. And so you kind of head there, and this brings up all of these, ethical and moral questions about people who are living here and what the future might look like. How was your experience there? I mean, I've been to the Salton Sea and I found it overwhelmingly eerie and quickly got out of town. I walked along a beach on, the northwestern side, and was quickly, it's like, I can't, this is an eerie landscape. And you go there and you spend time in Slab City, which maybe you can also explain to folks watching. And ending up there, how did that, it ends the book, and kind of leaves you with this impression that this is, hopeful, but leavened with the reality that we face. And obviously, as the person who wrote and structured this book, you may have had something like that in mind. But can you tell us a little bit about your experience there, and both like the ecology and what it looks like, and the people who are making their way in that place.
Yeah, of course. Because the structuring question is sort of interesting, actually, because certainly when I went to most of these places, I tend to travel to the places that I'm writing about at quite an early stage. So I know enough about them to know that they're there, a vague sense of what I might find, but I haven't done all of my sort of scientific, digging into the papers or doing all of the interviews yet. And it's more sort of getting a sense of where they might fit in the narrative. And the Salton Sea, my experience there was so striking, and that almost a sort of post-apocalyptic vibe, particularly in Slab City. I think partly because that's an explicit decision that people have made, and aesthetically, but also just generally that feeling is very sort of Mad Maxy, and many of their encampments are. For people who don't know, although I imagine a lot of people on this call will. So the Salton Sea is a man-made lake. It was formed by mistake, pretty much, when a irrigation canal overflowed. It flowed into a sort of dry playa and filled up like a bath, and it has been evaporating away. And the problem now is that you have very sort of deoxygenized water. You have toxic dust from all of the runoff, agricultural runoff, because they've been using this water for farms, and so it's quite high in nitrogen. You get algal blooms. And then Slab City is quite nearby. It's a short drive from the sea, and it's on an abandoned military base, and it's sort of I talk about it as being a sort of anarchic dropout commune / encampment, and very much it's built from literal trash. Some of it is very arty, very cool. Others much less so. And there are sort of problems with drugs, but also people go there to have an alternate lifestyle. So there's some people go there because they've got no other choice. Other people choose to be there freely, and probably the majority, actually, especially of the people that I met in summer. So that's kind of the diehards are there when it's well, it's like 50 degrees centigrade. I'm not sure, more than 100, certainly quite a bit higher than 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer. So it's really sort of the diehards are hanging around, I don't know. It was a very confronting place. It didn't always feel safe. It felt quite lawless. I mean, technically, it does fall under California laws, but I think lip service, and in many ways, it's not like you see police wandering around. And people have gone there I spoke to a young guy who slept under a tree. He'd hitchhiked there from, I think it was Colorado he started in, and he talked about the outside world as being like Babylon, and they were somehow some kind of tribe of people who were seeing the truth. The way that people talked about living there had something religious to it, something slightly cultish to it, but it was always sort of threaded through with this sort of risk or a sense of danger or something like that. And so I knew as soon as I got there that this was going to be the final chapter, because it felt to me like a vision of some kind of disastrous future. And in some ways it was horrifying and it really frightened me. And in other ways it sort of filled me with hope, because, frightening though it may be, these were nice people, and people were having a good time. And it felt like we were in the end of the world. And it just felt like a really natural way to be. So this is almost like post-climate change or post-disaster of some kind, and how we might start rebuilding a settlement out of the wreckage.
Right. Yeah. And as much as these kind of the more natural elements, the plants and the animals adapt to environments, these are human beings who have adapted to an extreme environment in a way that I found throughout the book really interesting. Some of actually a few of the audience questions here kind of deal with the more personal side of it, that very idea of risk. One of the things that I really loved about the book, and this is not to say anything negative about any other book, but there's a real element of nature writing in the 21st century that has to be memoir, right? It has to have this tangled thing worked into it, sometimes artificially just wedged in to fill a genre. And I really admired that yours is personal, but it's reflective, and it is a record of your journeys, but it doesn't tie into in a larger sense. It's like the autobiographical is implicit in a lot of things, which, thank you for that. It was very refreshing. And but Sam here actually asks, just about that, as you mentioned about the Salton Sea. Says I'm in Sam, he or she, I'm sorry. I'm impressed by your risk tolerance. The Chernobyl example you read is one. Many of us would hesitate to go into a hot zone of any kind. You went into a number of them, and you're willing to visit some areas of abandonment where predators of the humankind might have been encountered, as in the Salton Sea or Paterson even. And so how do you think about risk and reward in your work?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and one I think about a lot. So I had this sort of debate with friends. Many of these places, Chernobyl is a good example, because as I had to hire a local guide who goes in and out a lot. That's kind of her job, and she explained that unless we went to very specific areas in the zone, due to the process of radiation decay or natural decay, probably the amount of radiation that I would experience during my time there, which was over about 48 hours, and we stayed within the zone itself, was probably equivalent to maybe flying from London to New York on a plane. We don't have a strong sense of risk, especially when it comes to things like radiation. And I suppose the same goes for, yes, it is in some senses sort of physically dangerous. I guess I'm thinking of the urban spaces, particularly, partly from people, although everyone met, even if I was very intimidated when I first met them. I didn't actually meet anyone who meant me harm or meant to come off as intimidating. It was that matter of sort of speaking. As soon as you speak to people one-on-one, that people were always very friendly who I came across, even if they were living extremely alternative lifestyles. And that taught me a lot, I think, just about how to sort of face social situations head on, to try and sort of keep things friendly, keep things open, rather than sort of lurk around. It's always good to be like, hey, how are you doing? And sometimes people want to talk and some people don't, but it starts things off on the right foot, and I think that's important. But more particular, maybe in the urban spaces, there are physical dangers that aren't present in other places. I'm thinking specifically of things like hypodermic needles, broken, rusty things, broken glass, all that kind of thing, and collapsing buildings. Saying that, if you have sort of interest in the outdoors, so I'm an equestrian, I've always ridden horses particularly, and have done a lot of very long distance riding. That's just dangerous, and I think that's more dangerous, I think, than any of the stuff that I did for the book. And you just get used to that, and you do that all the time, and you just have to accept that, one day a horse might act out and you're done for, and that's it. And so I think anyone who does anything that's risky, you learn to live with a certain level of risk in your life. And certainly I find while researching these books, I think I'm probably quite a cautious person. I definitely don't think of myself as being particularly brave, especially not physically brave, because I don't think I'm that strong or anything. So I don't like to put myself in situations where I might have to force myself out of anything. So I think it's all a matter of perception, and once you get used to stuff, it stops feeling dangerous. So I think that's it. That's why urban explorers often start, frightened and nervy, especially abandoned places. I've come to think of them as hitting something of like an uncanny valley for people. So we find them uncomfortable because they're like places we know, but there's something off, and if they're proper ruins and they're just collapsing walls and that's it, they don't frighten us. But if you're in a sort of pure abandoned place, or something that hits just that spot that makes it eerie, it does put the hair up on the back of your neck, and you have to sort of learn that this is just a psychological response that you're having, and you can learn to get used to it. And I found that very much on that island called Swona, when I was alone on an abandoned island for about 24 hours, and I knew I was safe the whole time, but it felt like I was living a gothic horror, just because that's how you're programmed. You're not used to be alone. You're especially not used to there being animals moving around in your house, unless they're your pets. And all of that was just, my body was sort of twanging all the way through. I couldn't eat. I felt sick, and I'd go outside and be like, what are you scared of? What are you scared of? It was, I live in a place where it doesn't really get dark this time of year, and it's roughly that was what it was like when I was there. So it was almost daylight when I was going outside, and I was like, why are you so scared? And I think I dealt with fear a lot while I was doing this book, but I don't think I dealt with that much danger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it's so interesting, that idea of kind of reprogramming yourself. Also, I feel like throughout the book, you reprogrammed yourself, and as a reader, I felt reprogrammed as to how I see these places, because so many of these kind of post-industrial ruins are all around us. I mean, they're everywhere. I started to think, as where I grew up in New Jersey, as I mentioned, in the southwestern corner, it was, the Delaware River was lined with these places that we used to go into as kids, and of course we would never think of them as being, a place where nature is rebounding, but it was, a place to go and do just this sort of thing, climb up rickety old ladders, and probably much more danger than we were aware of, abandoned industrial plants and chemical plants. But and so what would your advice be to a reader, or someone who is moving about the world and kind of wants to see the ways that nature has adapted to us? Of course, it's not separate from us. It's here. Nature has been adapting to us, and in these places, it's this experiment, as you mentioned, in some ways, to see how it can adapt without our kind of overwhelming presence. Mm-hmm. Did you learn how to kind of rethink and re-see these places?
Yeah, I think it started happening by itself. Actually, the place I went that sort of sent me down the path of this book, although it's not in the book itself, I went to a series of small islands, which are off the coast of Scotland. They're called the Slate Islands because they were slate quarries in the 19th century and really a kind of epicenter of sort of slate mining in the world. So very human impacted places. They're very small islands, but they have quarries in them which are much sort of deeper than the islands are big, so they're like little donuts, and some of them are got lots of them on one place, and they look a bit like bubble wrap, I guess, and they're flooded with water. So I went to see them because a friend of mine who's an artist had painted them, and she was like, they're these incredible colors because the impurities in the rock color the water, so you get these turquoise pools, you get these really dark blue pools, these slightly kind of orangey pools, and so they look like paint palettes. So she was there to paint them, but also you can swim in some of them, they're safe. Well, safe-ish, you know. So I went to this place, and it wasn't specifically to look at the ecology of them, but it was because I found them aesthetically pleasing, and that I find that very shocking. You know, I find them beautiful, even though they were blasted, terrible, you know, completely pillaged environments. And what it really reminded me of was the photography of Edward Batinski, if you've ever come across him. He does these large format photographs of things like salt pans, or sometimes just huge mines. Sometimes it's like the way that freeways are sometimes pleating in and out of each other. And these images are incredible. And I remember reading a review of one of them, which said that the sort of appeal or the way that they pique our curiosity is because there's so much conflict or tension in our mind when we look at them, because they're beautiful, but they're also a sort of symbol of something awful. And it's hard to know how to read them. And so we're sort of, you get drawn towards them, you can't look away. And I think I started thinking about it like that. And then while I was spending time in the Slate Islands, I also noticed that they were all really overgrown with brambles. And, you know, I see somebody in the comments sort of mentioning Robert McFarlane, and I'd just been reading Landmarks. Is it Landmarks? The one that's sort of like a glossary of all sorts of natural terms.
Yeah.
And one of them is there's like an English word which is for like a desire path, basically, of animals going through hedges and scrubs and all that kind of thing. And this island was absolutely full of these little holes. You know, you could see that the second I stepped out of it, there was just animals all everywhere, you know, and it was really a sense that it was full of life. And I just couldn't get my head around that. So I think that place, Easdale in particular, but the Slate Islands generally, I just started thinking all about that sort of conflict. And I think I knew straight away, you know, when something sort of seizes you a little bit, I was like, oh, I could write about that. And it took quite a while to figure out exactly what it was. And that sort of abandonment sense, it kept coming up in interesting examples. And I began to see how they all sort of threaded together.
Yeah, well, it's a very successful experiment that you undertook. The book is really incredible and covers so much of and to see the origin, you know, in these little donut islands. A couple other questions here from the audience. Eric asks the question I think a lot of us deal with is that our climate and environmental challenges can seem overwhelming. Are there ways that you, Cal, disconnect from this work to recharge?
Yes, I think so. I would probably not personally describe myself as an activist. I definitely see like my role as being sort of, as a writer, I feel that's what I'm good at. But lots of my friends are very explicitly environmental activists. That's what they do, kind of for a living, and certainly that's what takes up all of their time and energy. And I know from them and from people I know who work in studying climate change that it can be, you know, it has a strong emotional impact, and you can get a kind of burnt out. I think people talk about like climate grief, that kind of thing, that feeling that you're sort of yelling into the void and people are just not changing the course of the ship. So I think to an extent you have to be able to switch off your brain at the end of the day, and that's hard. And for me, I think bearing in mind, I suppose, the position that I see myself as filling. Also, one thing that's really important to me is sort of finding hope, and that sense that things are not, trying not to become nihilist, right? And feeling like there's nothing that anyone can do, because then if we stop trying, then obviously then that is a disaster. And so it's trying to find a pace that we can move at. And for me, that requires seeing light at the end of the tunnel, seeing that there is something that that can happen, that there are sort of these carbon sinks springing up when we allow them to, seeing that biodiversity can come back through natural processes if we allow it to, you know, that sense that there are things that we can tap into that will allow life to continue in a greater sense, definitely allows me to sort of continue on with my day.
Yeah. So it's a somewhat related question from Susan. She asks, how do you stay open as a witness without expressing opinions, really? How do you, you know, that's a fine line to navigate as well.
Yeah, I think it's much, so I find this really hard when I was a reporter. No, okay, so I think personality-wise, I'm very good at not expressing opinions in that kind of thing. You know, I like to hear what people have to say, and often, especially when you're meeting people on their home turf, often I don't feel like I have an opinion. I'm just amazed that they are here and they live like this, you know, and they're happy to talk to me. So that's one thing. And I think when I had to work as a reporter, often I was sent in with a line given to me by the news editor, you know, get them to answer this, get them to, you know, this. And it's so freeing now to be just writing for myself, writing for things that I'm interested in, because it means that I don't have to force myself to ask questions I don't want to. I just ask the ones that I want to ask, the ones that I feel comfortable asking. And then I always find that organic conversation is also much more fruitful. You do always end up finding out more than if you go in with a sort of set of questions. So I think often I don't have strong opinions that I want to force on people, I suppose, is where I'm coming from. And I think that's often a weakness in me. Like this is not a polemic book. And I think some people maybe would like it to be, you know, especially when you're writing about the environment. Often there's sort of a pressure that you need to know what the answers are, what policies you want, where you're going with this. And I think that's not the kind of writer I am, or the kind of thinker that I am.
Well, in an age where it feels like everybody has opinions about everything, I found this very refreshing to actually approach a book with kind of the open-mindedness and an open heart that it feels like you had when you went into these places. So thank you for that. Yeah, no, it was. I really can't recommend the book highly enough to everybody watching, and maybe, you know, I own a bookstore, and so I always have to feel like I have to ask, you know, do you have recommendations for further reading for books about abandoned places or any particular places that you visited? You know, I know sometimes this question draws a blank for me, so I'll give you a pass if nothing comes immediately to mind. But I'd love to hear some recommendations.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of nonfiction, a lot of the stuff I read was very technical, but there were books that were definitely like sort of general reader touchstones that I just loved reading. Let's think from abandoned places specifically. So there's a woman called Rosemary. What's her second name? She wrote a very famous novel, but in the 20th century, called The World, My Wilderness, and it's set in post-Blitz London. I think she's called Rosemary something, and it's about this sort of wild teenager, and she's like roaming the streets of post-Blitz London, and it's tangled with all sorts of poppies and brambles, and they're in abandoned churches and all that kind of thing. But she also wrote a very large non-fiction book, which is called, it's something like Beautiful Ruins.
Oh, is this? Actually, Aaron, Rose Macaulay.
Rose Macaulay. Thank you. Rose Macaulay. That's it.
Yeah, Pleasure of Ruins.
Pleasure of Ruins. Yeah. That's it. That's an amazing book. I mean, it's not one that you sit down and read cover to cover. I think it took me ages, and I've lost so much of the great information that it's got in it. But it's just so good because she really, I think that's where I find that thing about sort of ruin hunting, ruin questing, and it being a heartless pastime. You know, it's just absolutely packed full of fantastic information. I read a lot of fiction, which was the sort of eerie feeling I was going for. So Jeff VanderMeer's Annihilation, that was a big one, and China Medieval I write about, and that's obviously not sort of specific, but it's it's specific background reading, but it was very, I guess I'm really interested in sort of atmospheric writing, and those books are really good at it. And also I'm interested in thought experiments generally, and I think that that's what good sci-fi does well. And then environmental writing, I love the sixth extinction. That was really very impressed by that book by Elizabeth Kolbert and how she threads through. I was trying to take, I guess, some sort of inspiration from how she sort of threads so many different things together into one argument. The Uninhabitable Earth, it takes a very different tack to me, by David Wallace Wells, but I think that the emotional impact of that book is really incredible. What else? Well, just people should read nature writing generally, and Kathleen Jamie is fantastic.
Yeah, she's one of my favorites. Well, and maybe the final question here as we come up on an hour. It's a beautifully written book too, and I wonder if you give thought to sort of how you approach aesthetically, because some of the descriptions in this book, there was a passage, I don't know if I'd be able to find it right off, but just some of the evocative descriptions that you bring up and you're capable of. Do you think, is there an ethical dilemma about writing beautifully about kind of ravaged landscapes? Is that something that is a consideration for you as a writer?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. One big worry was that I touched on this at the beginning, I think somewhat defensively, but I said that the big worry is that you say everything's going to be fine, and therefore we don't need to worry, and it's okay to damage the land, and we've talked about hope as well, and I absolutely think that there's a space for hope, and then there's the risk of becoming Pollyanna-ish. So I think you've always got to tread that line of trying to sort of have the light and the shadow and have them playing off each other, and try not to tip too far in either direction. And it's a hard line, I think, to find, and I think sometimes I get it, and maybe sometimes I wobble off, so I think we're all working at that to try and figure out how to navigate, how to write about these subjects.
Yeah. And it kind of, and echoes the pleasure of ruins, which without the preposition at the beginning is so evocative. Pleasure of ruins, and there is something pleasurable and to be gained from navigating these places. And I finished the book feeling a little better. I live in California, which I feel like I'm constantly on the verge of, like, why are we, mega drought. And there was a piece in The Guardian this morning about tree ring studies, referring that kind of have these alarming echoes to a mega drought in the 16th century and various things. And so, and this, like, the book opened my eyes, like, as I said earlier, to these landscapes around us that actually might provide a template or some sense of, like, we might not be fine, but the earth in some ways, like, something will be fine. And so thank you so much for the book and for joining us, and for everybody else too for joining us today. My only hope is that maybe by the time the paperback is here, that we'll be able to kind of do this again in person in Point Reyes. So thank you, and thank you for staying up late for us, and good luck with everything going forward. And we're gonna keep I'm gonna keep pressing this book into people's hands for sure.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Aaron who came up with Rose Macaulay, because I would have hated for her to go unnamed. So that's really good. Thanks, Stephen. It's been such a pleasure and really a privilege. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you again. And all right, goodbye, everyone. Hopefully we'll see you again at one of these soon. All right. Bye.
Bye.